And that gave us some organizational capacity as a community that was long, that was enduring. And in that context, we've learned some skills around how to solve problems. We have community meetings, which you just don't pitch each other about your barking dogs. We've learned to create sort of problem-solving space, and we've had a continuity to give us structure. We have committees, subcommittees, we report. It's given us some structure to hang together as a community to organize around these issues. Our history goes back to the 1960s when we weren't settled there yet, but there was logging and so on, and the remnants of that, or legacy of that logging, caused us to start taking a keen interest in stewarding our watershed primarily for water, and make sure that the logging was to the standards that we like to see. So the church, of course, so that gave us a lot of skill sets. Around 2000, through my association with heretics in the fire science wing, I began to import ideas to the neighborhood around the fact that this wildfire stuff is serious. And we began to see it ourselves. Any trip up to the watershed or water line, you'd start seeing trees falling in, and you go, this is some forest health problems. What's this going to look like in a few years? And that sort of animated us. So we have absorbed, since the early 2000s, the very first iterations. Don Mortimer was the author of the Fire Smart Manual. I used to go out and I was connected and brought in Jack Cohen's first videos that talked about spark and embers and all that sort of stuff. So the community began to gradually move towards that, a level of awareness on that, and that helped us. When Fire Smart came on full tilt, that gave us another advantage, and it gave us more structure, it gave us more purpose, and we were able to form a wildfire committee, and from that, we're proceeding along the lines of that strategy. We even have our own sign, which is illegally posted on the highway. Apparently you're not allowed to put signs like that, but we have anyways, in defiance of our friendly bureaucrats at MOTI. So, what have we accomplished? Okay, so we've had, as you heard, and Laura mentioned it, we are part, I think it's mentioned, we're part of the Fire Smart program, so we've gone through that recognition process. We've had 4 or 5 community fuel management days where we all go and work with each other and do treatments, and sometimes we have a lottery, we do that. We've also got a sprinkler system set up to protect that church. We've got private fuel management efforts have been ongoing. We've also got an emergency notification system that we borrowed from our friends in Argenta, where if there's an emergency in our community, it would be nice to have an inventory of who's who and also be able to notify each other. Because we're spread out over these properties, many of which, frankly, are fire hazards in themselves because they've become infested with broom, or they have been untended orchards or full of dry grass, things like that. We've been able to, nevertheless, we've got a notification system that if you're in a small community, you just go knock on the door, the person's going to be there. But in our neighborhood, they could be out on 16 acres in their yard. So if we ever got into a crisis, you don't want people going and knocking on doors looking for someone that's actually away on holidays. So we kind of keep a catalog and inventory of who's who, who's where, so that we can actually be a help in case we get to an emergency. We've also got a tool shed full of tools, and we engage in ongoing communication with our community. The key thing what we really do have, though, when I was alluding to in the church, is that we've managed through the efforts of leaders emerging the community, people who send out the notices, the communications, the education, we've managed to keep that going. And even during the winter, the fire subcommittee has meetings, so we keep that alive in the community. We found that you can't force anybody to do anything. We're a voluntary group. There's lots of issues around how we build whatever our authority might be, but we kind of lead by example. We hope that infects people and that they get the idea for that. So we're having some success, as I mentioned. There's still a whole lot of the place in Queens Bay needs to be modified. My own property is not a bad example, but to use myself as an example, I switched out my shake roof years ago. I bought $2,000 or $3,000 worth of hoses and pumps, and Nora mentioned the bladders. We've got that because we want to be able to, at least if we're going to leave our places, we're going to be able to at least have some sprinklers going. So now I'm going to jump up from the particular to the panoramic again, because I want to come back to this point I started with. We are, if I were to say that we're slightly ahead of the curve, and I almost skipped one of the key things, just a second. Let's go back to this map. Where we're at right now is that we're negotiating and we're planning on doing a fuel management treatment adjacent to north of a bay. And the elements of that are kind of interesting in that it comprises our community, it has regional district involvement and Ministry of Forest involvement, it has funding from FASBC. We are heading into climate change. I got 2 minutes, 1 minute, 3. We're heading into climate change, and this is an issue of governance and social economic change which we've never experienced before. Okay, what we're seeing right now may be typical, it may not, it may get worse, but we're into terra incognita, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's time I had some water because my spit's turning into 90 weight oil. Oh, that feels better. For it to me, yeah. Okay, so the trouble with, at the highest policy levels, the decision making that's typical at government levels, are no match for what we're currently facing, because these problems have taken decades to make. They're going to take a lot longer to, or maybe not longer, but they're not going to be fixed overnight. And the government, the typical political and economic cycles that guide our decisions are much shorter. So there's a disconnect right there. So we've got a major disconnect at the strategic level. At the operational level, we already talked a bit about it. You know how expensive it is to treat these things. There's a real challenge there. We can't operationally treat them. And at the tactical level, we already know that when it comes to responses, that we find that the government is, and as much said, don't expect us to show up. There's no cavalry coming over the hill. So to wrap up, John, and I will wrap up, I want to remind you, we could learn a lot by stepping out of the fire management and forest management regime and look at the natural hazard management regime, which has been ongoing for decades in the United States on floods. Did you know that heat waves are the things that kill most people? It's heat waves in urban settings. But if you look at that earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, what else? Name them, a whole bunch. What's that? Tsunamis. That too. Okay, right. Actually, great. Yeah. So if we go to that field, the way they make sense of things is that there are 4 key elements: mitigation, preparation, response, recovery. Because of shortage of time, I'm not going to elaborate too much more on them. But when I say we don't intend to be victims, what I'm implying there is, as a community, we want to have agency. By that, we want capacity to have an effect. We don't want to be collateral. We don't want to be things that are problems part. We want to be involved, and we want to be responsible. The reason I bring that up, and I want you to contemplate these things. When a real true disaster occurs, 90%, if not more, of the rescuing is done by the people on site at that time. It says something really wonderful about humans, okay? Even if it was the humans that blew the building up, but still, that's a part of the thing. I want you to remember that there's that impulse is there. I also want you to remember that it's dubious science, but it's probably, how many people here have done that mental inventory of what I'm going to take if my house burns down? How many people have gone through that? What does that feel like? Do you feel a bottom drop out of your guts every time you do that? No, I'm serious. I mean, that's an awful thing to go through. You're at the beginning. I call that pre-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? You're at the beginning. But what the psychologists will tell us is the level of disturbance is as profound as finding out that a close relative has died or you've just got divorced. Okay? That's the level of disturbance we're dealing with. So every time people come and knock on their door, that's the news they're delivering to tell you. Keep that in mind too, because I think by being not victims, we're trying to, in a sense, harness the positive thing about how we can take care of ourselves and mitigate the trauma. Okay, that's kind of where we're going with that. And by that means, and I will wrap up. That means that we want to be active in the mitigation planning. That's where you reduce the hazard in this case. We want to be part of the preparation, which is the education, communication. And this is a perfect example of that. Okay? And we even want to have a hand in the response, if that's possible. It's not unheard of throughout Australia that communities have their own trailer of fire suppression equipment. Why is that? Well, because maybe they can handle an ignition before it gets out of hand. And again, we don't want to be sitting there as sort of consumers of emergency services. Well, maybe we could be a little more self-reliant. And the recovery part too, you won't have recovery unless you have all those things in place. So it means, when I say have agency, it means to take the initiative, because frankly, as I said at the beginning, it's going to be very hard for the upper levels of government and the hierarchies to have an impact if we don't start from the ground up And we're gonna need these skill sets, because I have a feeling we're looking at some hard times going forward. If we don't develop those at the community level, we're gonna be lost, because there's no grown-ups coming to pull us out of the mess, and there's no cavalry, it's us. So on that fatalistic note, thank you.